Okay, great, working. So this session is about the Security Alliance Wargames, and Wargames is just one initiative of the Security Alliance. So if we go to the next slide. Perfect. So this is how the Security Alliance initiatives fit together. So you'll hear from a number of people that are involved over the coming sessions in this block. And really they're all complementary. So try and think about each part of the picture kind of fitting together. And so my name's Kelsie Nabben. I'm a SEAL, but I'm also LARPing as a SEAL in a way. So I'm actually an academic by training. And I'm doing research on the Security Alliance as an example of security in the digital economy. And obviously it's an exceptional example because they're first responders to a number of issues, as well as building social and technical infrastructure across the ecosystem to secure the future of crypto. So next slide. So this was my first experience of Wargames, stepping in to this welcome message, which happened on a scenario which was an exercise with a major DeFi protocol. And now I'd like to hand to Isaac Patka.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Isaac. I lead the Wargames initiative for SEAL. I'm also the co-founder of a company called Shield 3, which focuses on incident response training. I started working with Sam a couple of years ago when the Security Alliance was just forming, about how do we solve the problem of teams just completely melting down and panicking in war rooms once an incident finally happens. And so what we were trying to solve was just how can we prepare teams for these high pressure scenarios so that when an incident inevitably happens, as it does, like no matter how big you are or small you are, it's not a meltdown scenario, and like you trust your team, you know what to do, you know your tools work. And so what could we do to prepare those teams? And so what we do in these war game scenarios, or you could also think of them as just like incident response drills, but we like to think of them as war games, is that we just help teams test and improve both the social and the technical resilience of the team. It's one thing to know that all of your tools are going to work under pressure, but it's also another to know that you trust your team and you know that everybody's going to be able to perform properly. And so we're not just trying to incite panic in teams when we do these drills, but we want them to practice emergency response. And so in these drills, there's three main phases. We do just a lot of open source intelligence gathering, which just basically means we read every public doc, we read every contract, and we understand how the protocol works. We do a tabletop scenario in which we come up with 4 or 5 different possible things that we think could go wrong, tailored to the protocol. And then we ask questions like, how did you discover this issue? Do you have internal monitoring that alerted you to this? Or did you wait for somebody to just post on Twitter, like, looks like this exchange is getting hacked again? And so, like, is there monitoring that exists? Is there a playbook that exists? Who is responding? Who's awake? How are we communicating with these people? The tabletop exercise helps us understand those components of, like, what is the structure of the incident response maturity of this protocol? And that helps us lead into the third phase, which I think is the most fun, where we actually do a live attack simulation. And so we set up a forked network, we fork all their infrastructure, we replicate all their monitoring, and then they get, and then in some period of some hours on a certain day, there is an incident that takes place, and then everybody has to join a war room and respond as if it happens for real. And we learn a lot of very interesting things about how teams respond under pressure, and it helps teams just understand like how ready they are. So one reason why I think that these war games are important, and we could also zoom out and think of this more as like an operational security training. A lot of the recent hacks have been not due to smart contract bugs, which is great and a testament to the tooling that a lot of people here have built. It's like we're making fewer and fewer of the same dumb mistakes on the smart contract side, but we're making, as the protocols get more complex and large and become really critical global financial infrastructure, the operational side is suffering. And so what could we do to help teams prepare operationally for how to actually run these things long term? These are cross-functional exercises, so we're not just going in and working with the devs, but we're working with their auditors. Often, one thing that surprised me that I learned in this is that a lot of the times auditors will have like these really long-going retainer arrangements with these protocols where they're not just auditing your contract, but they're there for you to join a war room. Maybe they're on your Guardian multi-sigs to help support the protocol. So we're dealing with the devs, the auditors, the guardians who are actually supposed to be there and available to pause. Like, are they going to show up on the day of when you actually need to pause? Or are they like off in the woods and forgot to bring their ledger and can't pause the protocol? And then as far as like the communications team, there's a lot of tension we see in these war rooms between like, okay, the devs want to say publicly this thing is happening on the protocol right now, but the communications people that control the Twitter are like, no, maybe we should rephrase it. So you want to have the communications people in these things as well, and legal, because once you start having these like conflicts day of between like devs, legal, and communications of what can we actually do, what can we actually say, you want to have that worked out in advance, far before an incident actually takes place. So we've had the opportunity over the last year and a half to work with a lot of protocols in the space, and we've learned a lot from how the best teams operate. But the thing that I wanted to emphasize on this slide is like, how can you work with us? There's a few different tracks. One is we just published a open source toolkit for how to run war games on the SEAL GitHub. There will be a link later in the slide with like a long video walkthrough that I do saying, how do you do this stuff, what to look for. And so you can look at the open source repository. I'm holding a workshop at DevCon on how to use it. There's the like SEAL-sponsored non-for-profit track. And so if you're a big protocol that wants to get one of these drills, at no cost to you, you can come in and like get on our schedule. There's a waiting list, but like we can get on the schedule and we can work with you to do a drill at no cost to the protocol. And then there's also like a new like paid track that we're working on with like external companies, including my company, where if a project's on an accelerated timeline, they can get a drill within like a month or two. So the reason why we do war games, again, is that under pressure, like here's this quote that we found online that I actually found very hard to attribute, that under pressure you don't rise to the occasion, you sink to your level of training. I just think that that's very applicable, and it was either attributed to an ancient Greek poet or the Navy SEALs, but we couldn't figure out for sure. Each build for this is actually quite custom. There's a lot of moving pieces that goes into this. And so for each drill, it changes how we actually set up the live environment because so many protocols are different. But the core components stay the same. When we're doing a live drill, we of course need a forked network. So we could use like Anvil for that. We can use Tenderly for that. We need a block explorer because like we need to make the environment feel like a real scenario when the team is debugging. And so they need to have some ability to go into like a Tenderly debugger or like an Etherscan looking UI and actually click around and figure out what's happening. We need to have their monitoring replicated. So if they're using FortiBots, or if they're using like a custom solution, or if they have like things like Hypernative or Hexagate set up, like all of that stuff should also be connected to this forked environment so that it feels as realistic as possible. We create a lot of bots that simulate user behavior. So we'll have like these networks are like very noisy. And so we actually have bots that are scripted to be, if we're working with a lending protocol, we have bots that are doing deposits and lending and swaps, just so that like the Explorer is filled up with a bunch of junk as it would be in a real scenario if you were like dealing with an incident and working on Etherscan. We have like, of course, the exploit bots where at some point they'll like ramp up in intensity and exploit the protocol. And then often there's additional like internal UIs and things that we need to fork. So there's a big like week, 2-week build process that goes into each of these drills, but we're trying to make it more and more consistent so that we can do these at a faster pace.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to emphasize how much background research and work goes into preparing the scenarios and actually building the infrastructure to run these. And I don't know if anyone noticed in the previous slide, but on the Optimism base, which was our first multi-chain war game, SEAL 911 was actually called in the response, which was really cool. And so these are some of the scenarios that have been included for different war games that we've run. And one way we think about preparing these is through vulnerability mapping, which is a methodology that I've written about, and especially in relation to DAOs as well. So thinking about the socio-technical, legal, and economic dimensions of a protocol and protocol ecosystem. And like I said, as we've expanded the war games into like multi-chain scenarios, looking at those cross-chain dependencies and potential cascade effects as well. And so obviously as a social scientist, I'm really interested in the human and organizational dynamics of security. And so these are some of the things that have come up in the scenarios and also in the responses or room for improvement in the various things. And we do a massive debrief with every war game. We work with the team on that and try to provide them written documentation and help them reflect on how they actually went in that. And each war game has also sort of builds links into the other SEAL initiatives. So as I mentioned, 911, One really interesting aspect is that mindset of security, which Pascal Cavaccio, as Sam mentioned as well, said in a quote, absolute effing paranoia is the mindset that you have to have when it comes to blockchain. And then also a recent initiative by the Security Alliance from the SEAL ISAC, so the Intelligence and Analysis Platform, is around DPRK workers, the IT workers, and some of the social engineering that's happened behind the scenes that have led to major exploits. And so that's another human and organizational dynamic which we're looking at in the scenarios that we're running. And so we aim to help foster an attitude of continuous improvement. Each wargame results in a big debrief. The ethnographic observation, which is myself, is allowing for kind of generalizable insights to be published across not just academic papers, but blogs, book chapters, books, etc., forthcoming. As well as practical teams for tools. So as Isaac mentioned, the open source Wargames toolkit, and then we're also running a live event in Bangkok on the 10th, which has some really exciting scenarios that Isaac has prepared. And so we did want to save time for questions. We've still got about 10 minutes if anyone has one on their mind. While you think about those, I'll just throw to Isaac for some best practices that are arising from SEAL Wargames. And I don't know if we have a microphone runner, but I will run if I need. All right, we do.
Yeah. So before we get to the questions, just while you have a chance to think about them, I just wanted to go through just a few slides of what have we learned from how the best protocols act, so that we can just share some best practices. One is maintaining multiple channels to reach not just guardians but everybody who's kind of critical in incident response. Something that I always like to ask teams to think about is what happens if there's an incident and Telegram is down the day of the incident? How are you actually reaching these team members? Do you have backup ways of reaching them? Are you sure that all of your pager systems are working? In cases where pre-signing critical pause transactions is appropriate, that's another thing that we've seen a lot of teams do, where there's certain one bullet in the chamber pause transaction that sits somewhere accessible by certain people in case certain things have to happen. Or more teams I think are also using kind of these sophisticated auto pause service providers, which is really great to see as well. One thing that we learned a lot of things from how the Yearn team operates. They were this was one of the this was a really cool one for me to learn how it works. And this is all about risk isolation. And so a protocol like Yearn, which has assets deployed into many different protocols throughout the ecosystem, it was to me very interesting to understand how little contagion there was from one strategy to another. And so the idea of each component of a protocol being atomic and isolated so that it can't leak and cause issues with other parts of the protocol. And also every time a new strategy was deployed, there was an extensive risk diligence process and an emergency procedures card so that when the incident happens, it actually says step by step, one, this is the right person to call, but also if this person's not available, you take these steps to rescue funds from where they were deployed so that no one's questioning the day of how do I actually do it, because the emergency procedures are defined before the funds are actually deployed. Another thing on risk isolation from Aave, which I thought was very interesting, was how different collateral assets can be isolated with these different risk flags so that it can also minimize contagion between different asset classes, and individual collateral assets being able to be paused or frozen without affecting the wider protocol. Risk isolation, I think, is a key thing that we've learned. Incident postmortems is super important. This is another shout out to the Yearn GitHub, just because they have a really great postmortem process for every time there's been something that happened and how that gets integrated back into the playbook. And also mirroring monitoring. And so if you have an extensive monitoring setup on mainnet, you should also be running that monitoring thing on any testnet or any forks that you have so that you know that these monitoring tools are working, and also perhaps do things to trigger those monitoring tools, because the biggest stress of a lot of these backup tools is how do I know it's actually going to be there the day of when the thing happens? And so if you have a testnet setup or a fork setup, run your monitoring against your fork setups as well, in the same way that you would do it on mainnet.
Yeah, so coming back to the high level, these are some of the actionable recommendations that have arisen from SEAL Wargames. And we're going to pause there and invite any questions from the floor, which I believe we have some.
Hi, a quick question on what are your findings for best response teams have, like from psychological, not necessarily technical perspective, operational, psychological, how do you prepare for the incident?
Yeah, something that we saw in with some of the larger protocols is that there's a very clear incident commander who just is taking lead of the scenario, and so there's one team member who is always sharing when there's a war room call. There might be 30, 40 people on the call, but there's one person who's the incident commander who's sharing their screen, and they're taking notes live, where they're okay, there is a playbook that we're following. We did this step. We did this step. And then they're keeping track of all the different things. So if they've directed the communications team to prepare a public statement, they're they're the person that's putting that on the Google Doc and saying hey, communications team, what's the status of this? Hey, did we check with legal on this? Hey, the root cause developers that are looking, or the people that are analyzing exposure, there's one person kind of managing the incident and keeping notes in a very public way, versus teams kind of fracturing out. That's something that I thought was very important.
Yeah, I think one of the most stressful, to look at the other side of that scenario, as I saw for the response team, was calling guardians on a multi-sig. So they went through the actual process and called the real guardians, but that was, I think, 5 people across time zones. So they woke up people in the middle of the night. And yeah, that was quite interesting because I think it's a common practice across protocols, but for them to actually go through that process of making contact was very precarious in terms of getting onto them, and it was quite a time delay as well in terms of slowing down the overall time to pausing the protocol and ultimately stopping the hemorrhage.
Any other question?
Hey guys, you're amazing. Question about Compound, I think it is. Because did Compound have something happen after they had run a war game? And I was just wondering if there was anything on the feedback cycle there, because obviously it's somebody that you worked with and then you would have hoped would be more prepared for what was coming.
We haven't fully closed the loop on that, and I think that maybe we'll just chat with the Open Zeppelin or Compound folks to ask did the training we do actually end up helping you? Because that would actually be probably a useful data point for us to understand. So I mean, we could ask Michael, I guess.
Yes.
Thank you.
Let's just, I won't give numbers, but there was a amount of time for all the emergency signers to sign, and we found very specific areas where some signers were not as fast as the others, and we were able to correct for that, which was very helpful.
Cool.
There you go.
Anyone else? I don't see any hands raised.
Excellent. If not, then I'll just explain what we have on the slide here.
Yeah, please.
So on the 10th, we have an event that I'm very excited about with co-hosted between SEAL and Tenderly, with participation from a number of great protocols, including the folks from Aave and Uniswap and Yearn, Yearn Audit. So we're going to be doing an event which is a live war games kind of CTF style event where everybody will be competing against each other to white hat rescue funds on a bunch of challenges that we deploy. And so this will be a really good chance to show off your white hat skills. And then, so if you can make it to the event, fantastic. Also, if not, I'm working on kind of a take-home exercise version of it that we'll publish so that you can also kind of go in and do the challenges. Very much inspired by the work from the Red Guild with Damn Vulnerable DeFi, and with the benefit a lot of retrospective hack proof of concepts from the Immunify blog. So very much thank you to those teams. But yeah, we're doing some very cool live white hat exercises on the 10th.
And is there prize money?
There is some prize money, but it's mostly for the glory. This is a link to the Wargames drill template. I think we'll just tweet out all of this stuff after so that you guys don't have to see this or write this stuff down. But I recorded a long video of me just walking through actually in detail how you do a war game, including all of the bots and stuff that I've written for that. If you are a big protocol that wants to get on the waitlist for like a SEAL-sponsored drill, you can fill out a form on the Security Alliance website. If you're a protocol that is on like an accelerated time track and really wants to like, hey, we would love to do some like incident response training and do a war game, there's also a form on my website, Shield 3, where you can fill out just information about your company, and we can and fit you in as soon as possible. If you're also interested on the open source contribution side or working with me, just feel free to find me anytime throughout this week or even after.
Thanks so much.